Last time, we talked about the year 2021. Ever since we have had the Type 055 destroyer in tandem with the Liaoning aircraft carrier, we've been tearing through what they call the first island chain. Let's delve into some knowledge. What is the first island chain? The so-called island chains have both geographical and military significance. In the 1950s, U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles proposed the strategy of the island chains with the main goal of containing China. For example, the first island chain, if you look at the map, starts from the Japanese archipelago in the north, moves south to the Ryukyu Islands, connects to Taiwan, then to the Philippines, and finally to the Greater Sunda Islands. This chain practically encircles China, and it lies only about 160 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. The purpose of this island chain is to blockade China from the sea. If a major country cannot access the sea, it cannot engage in maritime trade. Without maritime trade, the economy cannot develop. Some might say, can't you just rely on land routes? But the terrain is difficult, and some national borders are not even clearly defined. So how would you go about it? In modern times, for a country to become a great power, it must have sea power. Why did China's economy struggle to take off before the 1980s after the founding of the People's Republic? It had a lot to do with the first island chain. At that time, we didn't have sea power. Later, during the US-China honeymoon period in the 1980s, we were allowed to pass through the seas, and from then on, our economy took off. So back then, our second-generation leaders had great foresight. They judged that this window of opportunity would last no more than 20 years at most. That's why we tightened our belts to develop the Navy, to secure our maritime trade routes. The sea routes are the lifeline of a major country. Whether it's for importing energy or exporting goods, it mostly relies on the sea. So in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were very clear-minded, realizing that the honeymoon period was coming to an end. The fall of our common enemy meant the end of the US-China relationship as we knew it. And sure enough, after everyone had their share of the Soviet Union's remnants, the US began to target us, leading to incidents like the Yin incident. See if it makes sense now. Then, from 1996 to 1998, there was a massive wave of state-owned enterprise bankruptcies and layoffs, leaving workers struggling to make ends meet. Why? It had a lot to do with the blockade of our sea routes. At that time, I was still in high school. I remember there was a girl in my class whose parents were both laid-off workers. Later, the whole family committed suicide. Cases like this were not uncommon in those days, especially in the Northeast, because it was an old industrial base. The products they made couldn't be sold, and domestic demand couldn't consume them. What could they do? Go bankrupt? Back then, many people blamed the state-owned enterprise system, saying it was fundamentally flawed and that laid-off workers were victims of the system. Sometimes, you really need to study economics. Once you learn some economics, you'll understand a lot of issues. At the very least, you won't lose money on the stock market. Speaking of stocks, I'm really happy these days. Why? Because I cleared out my stocks right before the Federal Reserve raised interest rates a few years ago. I knew things were going south, and no matter how low the market went in the past 2 years, I didn't buy back in. Why? That's the benefit of having studied economics. But let's not digress, let's get back to the first island chain. You see, our economic boom happened when we joined the WTO. We accepted very harsh conditions, but no matter how harsh, we had to join. That allowed us to go out to sea and do business with the world. Then look at the economic development over the following years. It was explosive, skyrocketing to make us the second largest economy in the world. The reason lies in that. You might say, after we joined the WTO, did the US stop hindering us? Did they stop causing trouble? You might be surprised, but yes, they did cause less trouble. Why? Because they were tied up by Bin Laden for 10 years and got bogged down in the quagmire of Afghanistan. They simply couldn't manage to do anything else. That's enough about the first island chain. Let's briefly introduce the second island chain. The second island chain is simpler. It stretches from Guam in Japan straight down south to the Iwo Jima and Mariana Islands, forming a line that cuts down to Australia. The so-called second island chain is the boundary line of the whole of Asia, including the East Asian countries, encompassing all of ASEAN. As for the third island chain, it doesn't really concern China. It's entirely drawn by the United States as its own defensive line, essentially representing the strategic frontier of U.S. security. It centers on Hawaii, extending north to the Aleutian Islands and south to some islands in Oceania. Now, why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor back then? It was actually an assault on America's final line of defense, the Third Island Chain. If the Third Island Chain were breached, the U.S. would be wide open, no longer safe. So, in 2021, we used the Type 055 destroyer and the Liaoning aircraft carrier to break through the first island chain. Do you think the U.S. can accept this? If you can take down the first island chain today, you might be able to take down the second island chain tomorrow. And if you take down the second island chain, are you planning to challenge the third island chain next? At that point, it's unclear who will be blocking whom. This has been a huge shock to the United States. Some might ask, why didn't the U.S. stop us quickly? In the last episode, we discussed why the U.S. allowed our Type 055 destroyer to run rampant until December. To understand this, you have to look at what the U.S. was up to in 2021. They were still stuck in Afghanistan, with most of their focus tied up there, not just their troops and equipment, but most importantly, their money was there. Business was still there. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about war, contractors, military procurement projects, and the final payments for the military-industrial complex. It wasn't feasible for them to abruptly change course. So, in August 2021, the U.S. hastily announced the end of the war in Afghanistan and quickly withdrew. They didn't even take the people who had worked with them, nor the equipment they had paid for, not even their local collaborators. You might have seen those collaborators clinging to the landing gear of planes in a desperate attempt to escape, with to falling to their deaths. Does this show that traitors never have a good ending? When they were fleeing with the Americans, even the dogs had a place on the transport planes, but not the collaborators. How tragic, clinging to the landing gear at such a high altitude. Imagine the desperation. If they had known it would come to this, would they have made the same choices? There are people like this in China too, thinking they are independently minded, but in the end, they might not even be as fortunate as dogs. So, why did the U.S. pull out of Afghanistan like a gecko shedding its tail? The reason lies with us because we broke through the first island chain. The U.S. realized, this can't go on. If we don't stop them now, they'll be unstoppable, so they abandoned Afghanistan and turned their attention to China. In August 2021, after announcing the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they began regrouping. By January 2022, look at the deployment of U.S. aircraft carriers. I bet I'm the only one on the entire internet who can find this information. Where were the U.S. aircraft carriers in January 2022? I'll read it out for you. This is the level of a top military enthusiast. I take notes, and I bet no other military enthusiast online does this. In January 2022, apart from the carrier station for repairs and the one guarding the central region, there was the USS Truman stationed in the Mediterranean, keeping an eye on Europe to prevent the UK from rebelling. The remaining 5 carriers were all in Asia, and all were stationed between the first and second island chains. For instance, the USS Reagan was stationed near Yokosuka, the USS Lincoln off the coast of Japan, the USS Essex near the Ryukyu Islands, the USS Carl Vinson, and the USS America in the Strait of Hormuz. 5 carrier strike groups gathered in Asia. What does that tell you? It shows that the U.S. had shifted its strategic focus from Afghanistan to the Asia-Pacific. At that time, there was a phrase, return to Asia-Pacific strategy, and this is what it referred to. Do you know why this happened? It was because of what we did in 2021 that scared the U.S. Typically, when the U.S. sends one aircraft carrier, it's a warning. 2 carriers are a threat, 3 carriers mean they're starting to evacuate citizens. If 4 carriers arrive, there's an 80 to 90% chance of war. If 5 carriers show up, there's no doubt they're definitely ready to fight. Also, I remember that on January 20, 2022, French energy giant Total and American energy giant Chevron withdrew from Myanmar. There were 2 reasons for this. First, Aung San Suu Kyi was overthrown by Min Aung Hlaing. Second, the U.S. wanted to use this as a pretext to take over Myanmar. If the U.S. had succeeded in taking Myanmar, China would have lost. Why? This is what's called great power geopolitical warfare. It's similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the day. If the Soviet Union had managed to establish missile bases in Cuba, placing nuclear missiles at will, the U.S. would have lost. If the US had managed to take Myanmar, how would ASEAN have reacted? They would see China as a country that can't even defend its backyard and would assume that China can't possibly defeat the US. They'd side with the US, keeping their distance from China to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. So, think about the series of events that took place in Myanmar in the latter half of that year. They're all part of what I'm talking about. Nothing happens in isolation. Look at the self-media online, with people commenting on Myanmar. Do they really think it's all about combating online scams? Everything is part of the great powers chess game, but let's not talk about Myanmar today. Let's continue discussing 2022 and how we use the thousand-hand Guanyin system to confront the USUC. In the first 10 minutes, I've been setting the background. Without understanding the background, there's no point in talking about the conflict. You need to know why we're fighting. Now, as for why we're fighting, we need to address another issue. The US assembled 5 carrier strike groups, ready to go all out against us. But was it just because of our repeated actions in the first island chain? Not entirely. The real reason is that the US had already sensed that China's thousand-hand Guanyin system was growing exponentially, especially in the second half of 2021, reaching a terrifying scale. Not only could it collect data, but it could also simultaneously command thousands of unmanned submarines lurking in the deep waters of the South China Sea to carry out tasks impossible for humans. Does anyone still remember that on October 2, 2021, the U.S. Seawolf-class nuclear submarine USS Connecticut collided with an unidentified object while operating in the South China Sea, injuring 11 sailors on board and forcing the submarine to be towed back to Guam? Those with a good memory might remember this incident. It happened during our National Day holiday. The U.S. nuclear submarine USS Connecticut was carrying out a mission in the South China Sea, just like it had done many times before. Although I couldn't find the specific mission details, it was most likely coordinating with electronic reconnaissance aircraft in the sky to gather hydrological and seabed information in the South China Sea to enhance the CIFOR database and prepare for the return to Asia-Pacific strategy. By October, we were well aware of the U.S. return to Asia-Pacific strategy. Previously, when U.S. submarines entered our South China Sea, we weren't too fussy about it. But now that they've made their plans public and are preparing to target us, it's no longer appropriate for them to come here. Since they came, we had to host them properly. So, the thousand-hand Guanyin system was activated, and thousands of sensors hidden in the deep sea were deployed. Don't be fooled by the Seawolf-class submarine's claim of having a 90-decibel underwater noise level, supposedly quiet enough to blend in with ocean noise and be almost undetectable. In the South China Sea, we have more than just sonar, and there are not just unmanned anti-submarine aircraft in the sky. As a result, the USS Connecticut, while quietly approaching us, ended up colliding. That was tragic. 11 people were injured on the spot, and 5 of them were unconscious. You can still find those photos online. Just look at how bad it was. The front half of the submarine was completely gone, smashed to pieces. And why do we say it was a collision? It definitely wasn't a torpedo explosion. If it had been a torpedo, the submarine would have detonated underwater. Imagine that, a nuclear submarine blowing up in our South China Sea. How would we ever eat seafood again? That's our territorial waters. So after the submarine was hit, it immediately surfaced, quickly turning into a lifeboat, drifting at sea for a whole week before it finally made its way to Guam, barely surviving. Upon reaching Guam, the U.S. immediately ordered that no crew members were allowed to disembark. The injured were evacuated by helicopter, and the rest of the crew was taken back to the U.S. in groups. The damaged submarine was covered tightly with a large tarp and towed back to San Diego Harbor. I remember being very puzzled at the time. Why did it happen like this? There was definitely something going on. They were clearly covering something up. Now, over 2 years later, more details are starting to leak out on U.S. websites. I can't guarantee the complete accuracy of what follows, as the source is from a non-commercial declassification website in the U.S. that isn't recognized by any government worldwide. By now, you should have an idea of what website I'm talking about. They say that at the time, the USS Connecticut was patrolling our South China Sea when all its sonar systems suddenly failed, with clear signs of human interference. Captain Cameron Al-Jilani of the USS Connecticut ordered the submarine to surface to periscope depth to maintain satellite data synchronization. But during the surfacing process, they experienced intense electromagnetic interference, causing the submarine's NBSY to underwater combat system to malfunction. Fortunately, the pressure gauge indicated that the submarine was still surfacing. About 2 minutes later, the BQS-2 for close-range, high-frequency active sonar detected a large object rapidly approaching from the left front of the USS Connecticut. Captain Cameron quickly determined that they were likely being locked onto for an attack and ordered the launch of WLY-1 torpedo decoys. However, just seconds later, a collision occurred. The impact was so strong that it caused the entire submarine to rotate to the right, injuring the 11 sailors who were thrown about during the rotation. According to subsequent reports, the USS Connecticut never received any warnings or expulsion notices throughout the incident. The report ultimately and somewhat arbitrarily attributed the collision to a high-speed unmanned Chinese submarine. Look at how the Americans are shifting the blame. It's clear they just weren't skilled at maneuvering. It must have been drunk driving, hitting a reef, and they blame everything on us. It's really annoying. On October 8, 2021, the first day back to work after the National Day holiday, Mr. Zhao from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs hosted a regular press conference, urging the U.S. to quickly investigate whether the collision caused a nuclear leak or environmental damage in the local ocean, expressing strong concern. What did that mean? It was basically saying, "What were you doing here? You rammed your head into a mountain and dirtied up our front yard. Who's going to clean that up? You can't just walk away from this." Later, U.S. military assessments showed that the force of the collision was perfectly controlled, and the location of the impact was incredibly precise. Not only did it avoid causing a nuclear leak, but it also allowed the submarine to retain some propulsion for a slow return to base. This information caused quite a stir at the Pentagon. They were shocked, thinking, "Good grief, has China raised some kind of monster in the South China Sea? How many years did it take to create such a thing? This isn't just a neural network data chain, this is a real kill chain. We better stop messing around in Afghanistan and quickly head to Asia." You see, this series of events led to our deadly showdown with the USSC for neural network system in the first island chain in 2022. How did we manage to overpower their 5-carrier strike group? We'll talk about that next time.